Hello, thank you so much for joining me. My name is Sam and I'm an educator at the Cincinnati Observatory. I'm very excited to partner with the Campbell County Library to bring you this video. Now, for those of you who don't know, the observatory is located in Mount Lookout. This wasn't always the case though. The original observatory was actually in Mount Adams, but in the 1870s, there was so much coal smog from downtown that the astronomers had to relocate so that they would be able to see the night sky. So this building is our current building. It was built in 1873. We have two buildings, this one and a smaller one, and you probably noticed they both have a domed roof. And if you guessed that that's where we keep our telescopes, you are absolutely correct. So the jewel of the observatory is the 1845 Mitchell telescope. And the reason that it's our jewel is because of how old it is. It's actually one of the oldest telescopes that you can still use in North America. It actually just had its 175th birthday. One of the things that I think is really special about it is that it's made out of wood. And before I worked at the observatory, I didn't realize that old telescopes were wooden, or at least some of them were. So I think that makes it extra special to use and to look through. And getting to look through a 175-year-old telescope is pretty spectacular. Now we also have a larger telescope, our 1904 Clark telescope, which is also a pretty fantastic telescope. Now with both of these, we can see pretty distant objects in outer space. But not to worry, if you don't have a telescope, you can still enjoy astronomy. There are a lot of objects that you can see just with your naked eye. Now, as far as observational astronomy goes, a lot of people think that late October, November, December is not a very good time. And I understand that because it does tend to be pretty cold. It can often be rainy, which also means cloudy. And if it's cloudy, we can't see the night sky. However, the sun sets pretty early, which means you don't have to stay up late to be able to do astronomy. And when it's a clear night, it's usually very, very clear because there's usually low humidity. Now, November of 2020 is actually an especially good time to be doing observational astronomy. And that's because several planets are visible just to the naked eye. So out of our 8 planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn are visible to the naked eye. And we can actually see all 5 of those from the greater Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky area in November of 2020. So that's pretty amazing. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about each planet, including some of the mythology behind each of them. So when we talk about planets, we usually think of them in relationship to Earth, since that's where we live and that's where we are viewing everything from. So the planets that have an orbit outside of Earth's orbit, we call superior planets. So it'd be Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. And out of those, we can see Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And then the planets that orbit inside of Earth's orbit, we call inferior planets. And of course, that's Venus and Mercury. Now that doesn't have anything to do with the quality of the planets, it's just the location. So let's focus on these superior planets to begin with. So the one that is closest to Earth is Mars. Mars got its name from the Roman god of the war. So all of our planets, with the exception of Uranus, are named after figures in Roman mythology. Uranus is named after a figure in Greek mythology, which relates pretty closely. So these planets were actually seen by the ancients and named by the ancients. And since we have so many records of Roman culture and history and science, that's kind of what's trickled down and what we still call the planets. So the Romans looked up at Mars and they could tell that it was a reddish color. And so they associated that with blood and thus with warfare. A little bit morbid, but also makes a lot of sense. And actually, we know that a lot of other cultures named Mars based on its color as well. If you look closely at this picture of Mars, you can also see its 2 small moons, Phobos and Deimos. Now, Mars, the god, was very important to the Romans for a couple of reasons. The obvious being that the Romans did engage in a lot of warfare. They were very interested in conquering other places and expanding their empire. But in addition to being a fairly warlike people, they also really looked up to Mars because they thought that he was the father of their founder. So Mars was supposedly the father of these twins named Romulus and Remus. Now, Romulus and Remus were born in a city called Alba Longa, which was in ancient Italy, not too far away from where Rome would eventually be built. And they were the grandsons of the deposed king of Alba Longa. And the current king, when they were born, decided that they should be slaughtered because he was worried that they would grow up and try to retake the throne. And so he had them thrown into the river and left for dead. Now, luckily for Romulus and Remus, a she-wolf rescued them and suckled them until a local herder took them in and adopted them. Now, Romulus and Remus grew up not knowing who they were. They had no idea that they were descendants of royalty. But eventually they became adults and they found out. And they decided to help their grandfather retake his throne. And they were successful. And after that, they decided that they wanted to found their own city nearby. So they found the perfect location. The river was close. There were 7 hills. They thought it was perfect. But they argued about which of the 7 hills their city should be built on. And they decided that whoever saw the most birds would be the one to decide which hill to build the city on. And Romulus saw the most birds. Seems like a silly way to solve an argument, but they thought that that showed the favor of the gods. So Romulus was the one to decide which hill to build the city on, but Remus was a little bit salty about that. And so the two of them got into a fight, and Romulus ended up killing Remus. But he did go on to found his city of Rome, and so the Romans really admired Romulus, and thus paid a special attention to Mars being Romulus's father. Now, the only god that was more important to them than Mars would have been Jupiter, who was the king of the gods. Now, I mentioned earlier that Roman mythology correlates pretty closely to Greek mythology. So if you're more familiar with Greek mythology, Jupiter would be the equivalent of Zeus. And Mars, who we were just talking about, would be the equivalent of Ares. So Jupiter, of course, is the king of the gods, so it only makes sense to name the largest planet after him. And the Romans knew that Jupiter was very large in the night sky and very bright. And so they decided, okay, this one has to be named for the king of the gods. And it worked out especially lucky because Jupiter, the planet, is very stormy. And Jupiter, the god, was a god of storms. In fact, he was known to throw lightning bolts down from his home onto Earth. So it works out really well that the largest planet is also a stormy planet and is named after Jupiter, the king of the gods. So this is what Jupiter looks like through our telescope. You can see the stripes all across Jupiter. Those are different bands of storms. And you can see the small dots next to Jupiter. Those are the 4 largest of Jupiter's moons: Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. Now, all 4 of those names are characters in Roman mythology. And we're going to talk a little bit about Callisto specifically in a little bit, so kind of keep that in mind. But if we move out past Jupiter, we find Saturn, the last planet visible to our naked eye. And through a telescope, you can actually see the rings. So Saturn we usually see up in the night sky, fairly close to Jupiter. Depending on where they're at in their orbits, Jupiter is usually a little bigger and brighter. Now, Saturn is named after a Roman Titan, who would be the equivalent of Kronos in Greek mythology. So the Titans came before the gods, and Saturn was actually Jupiter's father. So Saturn did a pretty good job of ruling the Titans and ruling Earth until he heard a prophecy that one of his children would overthrow him. And when he heard that, he went a little nuts. And so every time his wife, Rhea, would give birth, he would eat the baby, which Rhea did not really like. And this happened about 7 times before Rhea decided that she was fed up with this and she was going to trick Saturn. So what she decided to do, she gave birth to baby Jupiter, and instead of giving him to Saturn, she gave Saturn a rock dressed up in swaddling cloths. And I guess Saturn must have been pretty easy to trick because he ate the rock and never noticed that it wasn't a baby. So Rhea hid Jupiter, and Jupiter grew up big and strong and eventually overthrew Saturn. So the prophecy came true, and in overthrowing Saturn, Jupiter cut open Saturn's belly and all of his siblings came forth, including some of the other gods we're going to talk about. All right, so that gets us back to Callisto. So remember, that's the name of one of Jupiter's moons. And I wanted to talk about Callisto specifically because she kind of gets two celestial objects named after her. So one of Jupiter's moons is named Callisto, but then there's also a constellation of a large bear called Ursa Major. And Ursa Major is the same as Callisto in mythology. So Callisto was one of Diana's handmaidens. Diana was the Roman goddess of the hunt. Again, if you're a Greek mythology fan, that would be the equivalent of Artemis. And Diana and her handmaidens had taken a sworn vow of virginity because Diana didn't really like dudes and no men were allowed in her sacred woods. But unfortunately for Callisto, Jupiter saw Callisto and fell in love with her. And once Jupiter fell in love with you, he was bound and determined to seduce you. And he was able to eventually seduce Callisto and he got her pregnant. Now that was a problem for Callisto because she knew that Diana would know that she had broken her vow of virginity and cast her out of the secret woods, which did eventually happen. And Callisto gave birth to her son and she decided it was worth it because she loved him so much. But unfortunately for Callisto, Juno, Jupiter's wife, the queen of the gods, was very upset that Jupiter had fathered yet another half-mortal child. And so Juno, that would be the equivalent of Hera in Greek mythology, decided to turn Callisto into a bear. So poor Callisto is now a bear, and her son is given to another family to raise, and Callisto has to spend her life just wandering around the woods. Now, one day, Callisto's son grows up to become a hunter, and he is hunting in the woods where Callisto lives. Callisto sees him and instantly knows that it's her son, and she's so excited to see him. She hasn't seen him since he was an infant, so she runs towards him, forgetting that she's a bear. And of course, her son has no idea that his real mother is actually in the form of a bear, so he sees a bear coming running at him. He pulls out his bow and arrow, and he's getting ready to shoot Callisto. Luckily, Jupiter notices all of this from up on his perch on Mount Olympus, turns Callisto's son into a bear, grabs them both by their tails, swings them around, and flings them up into the night sky. And the process of throwing them, their tails stretch and stretch, and become nice and long, and luckily Callisto and her son both land up in the night sky and become constellations. So Callisto is the constellation Ursa Major, her son is the constellation Ursa Minor, but we know those constellations by more common names, the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper. So Callisto is kind of astronomically famous because she gets two celestial objects named after her, a moon and a constellation. So now that we've covered all of the superior planets that are visible to the naked eye, let's talk about the inferior planets. So the two inferior planets are Venus and Mercury. And remember, inferior doesn't mean that they're not as good, it's just because they orbit inside of Earth's orbit. Now, both of these planets are visible to the naked eye, but they can be a bit tricky to see because they orbit pretty close to the sun, especially from Earth's perspective. So Mercury in particular is a bit tricky, but there is a shot to see it in 2020, so I'll tell you guys how to find it. But let's talk about these planets first. So Venus is named after the goddess of love, and that's because Venus shines so brightly. It's really a beautiful object up in the sky. And actually, other cultures beyond Roman named Venus after their goddesses of fertility and womanhood. So lots of societies looked up, saw Venus in the sky and thought, wow, it's beautiful just like a woman. And Venus is pretty cool because it goes through phases. So if you look at this picture right here, it shows a progression of Venus's phases. And we'll talk about why Venus has phases in a moment. But to see Venus, you have to go out either right at sunset or right at sunrise, depending on the time of the year. Now, in November of 2020, Venus is rising in the morning, so you have to go out at dawn. And right before the sun comes up, you'll notice Venus shining very brightly in the morning sky. So that brings us to our last planet that's visible to the naked eye, Mercury, named after the messenger god, usually shown wearing winged sandals and a winged hat. And Mercury was known as a trickster god, which I think is pretty appropriate for the planet Mercury because it is very, very tricky to see. So because Mercury is the closest planet orbiting to the sun, it is very tricky to see it from Earth, with or without a telescope. But in November of 2020, if you go out just as the sun is rising, you'll have to find an area where there are no trees, a nice clear horizon. But if you can find a nice clear horizon, you'll be able to see Mercury. And it'll just be a very bright dot in the sky that's kind of following the path of the sunrise. But of course, once the sun starts to come up, it gets too light and you won't be able to see it. So there's just a very narrow window where you can see Mercury. All right, so I mentioned that Venus has phases. Mercury has phases as well, and that's because the two of them orbit between Earth and the sun. So it's not that there's anything different about the planets, it's their orbits. So that's what makes them inferior to Earth, is they're on the inside of Earth, and thus we see phases on them, just like we do the moon. So as the planet orbits around the sun, a different amount of sunlight reflects back at Earth, and so we're able to see a different amount of the planet. Sometimes it's a full Venus or Mercury, where they're on the opposite side of the sun from Earth and they're reflecting a lot of light back at us. Sometimes it's gibbous, half crescent, or new when it's not visible at all. That's one of my favorite things about looking at Venus through a telescope, is getting to see the different phases. Because we don't really see very many surface features on Venus because it's completely covered in clouds, but it's very interesting to see those different phases. Now, in addition to planets, there are some pretty awesome constellations up this time of year. And I wanted to talk about two that will be coming up later in the season. So this will be probably once we aren't able to see the planets much anymore, we'll be able to see this constellation, which is my absolute favorite. I'm sure you've heard of Orion before. Orion's belt is kind of very well known. So Orion, this is what it looks like up in the night sky. He's a mighty, mighty hunter from Greek and Roman mythology. So Orion was meant to be a very mighty hunter, and it's easy to find up in the night sky because of the 3 stars that make up Orion's belt. So those 3 stars in the middle make up Orion's belt, and I do think it's one of the constellations that at least vaguely looks like what it's supposed to. I definitely see a person there. Now, if you have a telescope, or if you have access to a telescope, Orion is a really cool constellation because it includes a nebula. So this area here, you might notice the second star in that string of 3 looks a little different. It's a little fuzzy like cotton candy. So if we zoom in on it, it's actually a nebula, the Orion Nebula, or M42. Now through a telescope, it doesn't look nearly this colorful. It looks more grayish because this has a filter on it, because nebulas are giant clouds of dust and gas out in outer space, some of which form new stars or new planets, and they emit a lot of different colors of light that we can't see with the naked eye. So usually when a scientist or photographer takes a picture of a nebula, they will overlay a filter on it so that we can see what it would look like if our eyes could perceive that type of light. So seeing it through a telescope, it's more of a grayish color, but it's still really beautiful. The other constellation that I really love that's up in the late fall and winter skies is Taurus the Bull. And it's right next to Orion. And the reason I like it is it's easy to find and it has a couple of cool stars in it. So the biggest star in it is called Aldebaran, and that's the eye of the bull. And then right over the shoulder of the bull is a cluster of stars called the Pleiades. And I love seeing the Pleiades with my naked eye because it looks like a diamond necklace. It's a bunch of stars really close together that really, really twinkle. All right, so now that we've learned a little bit about the mythology of the planets, I wanted to show you how to find the planets in the night sky. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to use a special computer program called Stellarium. Now, Stellarium is available for download. You can download it on your computer, on your phone, but there's also a free web-based version. All right, so this is what Stellarium looks like when you first open it up. Because this is what it looks like outside right now, nice and sunny, so we have to make it night. So the great thing is you can change this to be any time of day, any time of night that you want. So I'm going to have the sun set, and I'm going to actually move this forward. So it's set for November 24th. All right, so we've got that all set, and now what we want to do is try to find some of these planets. So the easiest way to do it is to start off by looking south. And depending on when you're doing this, the moon may be there or not. You might need a compass for this, but if you start off by looking south, and then you look just to the west of south, you'll find Jupiter and Saturn. Now you'll have to go out right as the sun is setting, because Jupiter and Saturn are up during the day this time of year. And so they are setting kind of with the sun. So there's Jupiter and Saturn up in the night sky. And the way that you can tell that they're planets is that they don't twinkle. So stars emit their own light and they twinkle, but planets reflect light and don't twinkle. So Jupiter is the larger one, and then Saturn is just up and to the left of it. So it's really, really easy to find Jupiter. It is crazy, crazy bright. As the sun is setting, it is the very first object that you'll be able to see in the night sky. And then as it gets just a little bit darker, you'll be able to see Saturn kind of over Jupiter's shoulder. And then if we go back to south and we kind of go southeast, you'll be able to see Mars. Now Mars is going to be really easy to see because it's so high. And so you'll be able to see Mars November and December, and you don't have to go out quite as early because it's staying up in the sky much longer. Actually, for most of November, it should be visible for most of the night. So Mars will be high in the sky, kind of southeast-ish, and it definitely has a reddish color. So if you find it up in the sky, again, it won't be twinkling, but it'll be very, very red. All right, so we've got those two. Let's see if we can figure out Venus and Mercury. These are a little bit trickier, so we have to go back and make it early morning. So we're going through the night. You can see it's set on military time, so now we're at midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4, 5. All right, so around 6 is when, or around 6:30 is when the sun starts coming up. So I'm going to go back just a little bit. Let's see. All right, so the sun rises in the east. So since Venus and Mercury are kind of following the sun, we have to go to the east. So you can see there's Venus right over by the east, and it'll be visible starting around, let's see, let's go back in time, we'll see. By about 6 o'clock, you should be able to see Venus, 6 in the morning. I know that's awfully early. And then Mercury, okay, this is the tricky one because you'll have to go out right around 6:40 to 6:50, and Mercury will be visible. Venus will still be visible as well. You might even be able to see this star Spica and this one Arcturus, but Venus will be the brightest object in the sky at that point. So to find Mercury, you're gonna kind of wanna make a diagonal from Venus towards the horizon. And again, you're gonna have to find somewhere like a field that doesn't have any objects like buildings or trees in the way, and then you'll be able to see Mercury. And then the sun will rise and continue to rise. You can see Mercury, you can see it still. You can still see it until the sun just starts to peek over the horizon. So right about there, so just about 7:10, you will not be able to see Mercury anymore. You'll still be able to see Venus, but not Mercury. So it's a very short window from like 6:45 to like 7 a.m. that you'll be able to see Mercury. But that's a pretty cool thing to do because not a lot of people see Mercury because it is so hard to find. Now, Stellarium is not the only way to figure out where the planets are. If you're like me and you're not very technologically advanced, there's another way you can do it too. You can use a star chart. And there's actually a free website you can go to get a star chart. All right, so if you go to this website, which is skymaps.com, you can download a free star chart. So what you do is you click download the latest issue, and then you scroll to your location. If you are living in Cincinnati or Northern Kentucky, you want the Northern edition, so you just click download, and there you go. You can either leave it pulled up on your computer or you can print it off. And so this is a map of the night sky. And so it shows you where Mars is going to be, Jupiter, Saturn, and where a lot of the constellations will be. And the cool thing about this is you can take it outside with you and kind of use it to find what you're looking for. And the way that you use it, since it's kind of a circle, what you do is you turn the circle to whichever direction you're looking at. So let's say you're looking into the northern sky. So you want to find north on the circle and turn that towards your body. So the outside of the circle is the land, is the horizon. And then the very middle of the circle would be whatever you see when you look straight up into the night sky. So pretty easy to use, actually. Well, all right, thank you guys so much for joining me. I hope you learned something new about our planets. Make sure you check out our website, cincinnatiobservatory.org, for more space resources. And don't forget to check out your local library for more space resources, not to mention mythology resources. The library is a great source for learning more about the mythology of constellations, planets, and just Greek and Roman mythology in general, because it's pretty dang cool.